Policy lessons from South Korea's development. Korea's economic takeoff in the 1960s and the making of a Korean model with Kihwan Kim.
Hello, I'm Kim Kihwan. I am honored to take part in this series of video presentation on Korea's economic growth. Korea started to grow in 1962 and continued to do so at a high rate for about 50 years. The average annual growth rate for the whole period from 1962 through 2010 was about 7%, which was twice that of the rest of the world. To shed some light on how Korea achieved such high growth over such a long time, I will answer 4 questions. First, what were the socio-cultural factors that helped Korea achieve such high growth? Second, what were some of the key macroeconomics and industrial policy reforms the Park Chung-hee government implemented to start and sustain high growth? Third, to what extent was the Park government influenced by advice from international organizations such as the USAID and the World Bank? Lastly, to what degree are the policies taken by the Park government applicable to developing economies in the world today? There are important socio-cultural factors that helped achieve high growth. First, Korea carried out land reform from 1948 to 1950. Basically, this reform brought about redistribution of the land ownership of land from the absentee owners to actual farmers. Among many things, this reform compelled the landlord class to go into business and industry. The reform also enabled many farmers financially to provide secondary and tertiary education for their children. The introduction of universal compulsory education was a second factor. Implemented between 1948 and 1950, this reform not only increased the literacy but also the productivity of average Korean worker. Similarly, the universal military draft, adopted at the beginning of Korean War, enabled young Korean workers to acquire discipline and efficiency needed in a modern organization through their military training. Paradoxical as it may sound, the Korean War itself had a profound impact on Korea's economic development. The war had a tremendous leveling effect on society. As a result of the war, many Koreans lost their traditional inhibitions on the choice of jobs and actively pursued work in trade and industry. Similarly, the division of the Korean peninsula had a positive effect on economic development. As the two Koreas became strong ideological rivals, both competed economically so as not to lose to the other. The last factor I want to mention is the strong desire on the part of many Koreans to outdo the Japanese in almost everything. This has resulted in the quickening of technological advances in Korea. Now let's see what new economic strategy and policies the Park Chung-hee government adopted in the 1960s and the early 1970s to kickstart economic growth in Korea. First of all, he adopted a market-based economy for Korea. This raised the overall efficiency of the Korean economy. In addition, Park adopted an outward-looking development strategy, emphasizing the growth of exporters, as opposed to an inward-looking strategy, emphasizing the growth of import substitution. In line with a market economy and an outward-looking development strategy, Park introduced a number of important macroeconomic and industrial policies. These included revamping the National Tax Administration, raising the interest rate on bank deposit, replacing the old multiple exchange rate system with a unitary exchange rate, and devaluing the Korean won vis-a-vis the US dollar. The Park government also provided short-term finance for exporters, exempted import duties on raw materials and equipment used for export production, and drastically simplified custom procedures. All this and more went far to enable Korean exporters to conduct their business as if they had been operating under a free trade regime. With the primary aim of strengthening the competitiveness of Korean industry through R&D, the Park government also launched the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, known as KIST, in 1966. This was followed by the establishment of Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology in 1972 and the Data Technology Park in the following year. In 1973, the government also launched the Heavy Chemical Industrial Development Drive with the dual purpose of upgrading the nation's industrial structure and strengthening its national defense capability. An interesting question to consider is to what extent were all these policy actions and programs influenced by international aid organizations and their policy advice? The simple answer is a great deal. Let me give you an example or two. The USAID people in Seoul wholeheartedly supported Korea's outward-looking strategy and all of the related reforms. Indeed, there is some testimony that says the adoption of such reforms was as much a brainchild of USAID officials as that of Korean policymakers. We should also recall that such multilateral financial institutions as the World Bank ADB had policy input as well. The World Bank in particular was very conspicuous in highlighting the critical importance of vocational training at the early stage of Korea's industrial development. Thus, it provided not only specific financial aid for the purpose, but on-site advice for implementation as well. I want to touch briefly on the question of whether or not Korea's macro and industrial policy reforms implemented in the 1960s and early 70s should be introduced to developing countries today. My answer is clearly yes. They were all sound theoretically. There is, however, one caveat. Although all the new policies implemented by the Park government were sound, implementation would likely not have been successful without Park's strong and single-minded political leadership. Thank you.